The year is 1944. You're a German soldier, and the tide of war has turned. Enemy forces surround you, and surrender is your only option. What happens next would determine whether you survive to see your homeland again, or become one of millions who never returned home. Today, we'll explore the untold stories of German prisoners of war during World War II. Their experiences vary dramatically depending on who captured them, where they were held, and when in the war they were taken prisoner. This is the story of survival, adaptation, and the human cost of global conflict. Over 11 million German soldiers became prisoners of war during the conflict, making it one of the largest population movements in human history. These weren't just statistics, they were sons, fathers, and brothers torn from their families and thrust into an uncertain future. Their stories reveal the complexity of human nature during wartime, showing how ordinary people adapted to extraordinary circumstances while clinging to hope of eventual return to their homeland. Picture this: you're exhausted, outnumbered, and running low on supplies. The sound of enemy tanks grows closer. Your commanding officer makes the difficult decision: it's time to surrender. White flags are raised, weapons are dropped, and hands go up in the universal gesture of defeat. The first moments of capture were crucial. Allied forces had been trained to follow the Geneva Convention, which protected prisoners of war. However, the reality on the battlefield wasn't always so orderly. Your immediate fate often depended on the unit that captured you and the circumstances of your surrender. Some soldiers were treated with basic dignity from the moment they raised their hands. Others faced anger from troops who had lost friends in recent fighting. The key to survival was often cooperation and showing that you posed no threat. The psychological shock of surrender was profound for many German soldiers who had been taught that capture was shameful. Suddenly, the military structure that had defined their lives disappeared, replaced by uncertainty and dependence on former enemies. Many prisoners later recalled feeling relief mixed with fear, relief that the fighting was over for them, but fear about what lay ahead. The transition from soldier to prisoner happened in mere moments, yet it fundamentally changed how these men saw themselves and their place in the world. After capture, you'd be quickly searched and your personal belongings confiscated. Military intelligence officers would conduct initial questioning, trying to gather information about German positions, troop movements, and military capabilities. Your name, rank, and service number would be recorded. This information was crucial. It meant you were officially recognized as a prisoner of war, which provided certain protections under international law. You'd receive a prisoner number that would follow you throughout your captivity. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established rules for treating prisoners of war. These included providing adequate food, medical care, and shelter. Prisoners were supposed to be protected from violence and allowed to communicate with their families through the International Red Cross. The processing phase could last anywhere from hours to several days, depending on the military situation and available resources. During this time, wounded prisoners received medical attention, and basic needs like food and water were provided. Many prisoners were photographed and fingerprinted as part of the documentation process. Personal items like family photos, letters, and religious objects were sometimes returned after inspection, providing small but significant comfort during this traumatic transition. The efficiency and humanity of this initial processing often set the tone for a prisoner's entire experience in captivity. Your experience as a prisoner would vary dramatically depending on who captured you. Let's explore the different fates that awaited German soldiers. If captured by American forces, you'd likely be transported to camps in the United States. Over 400,000 German prisoners were held in America during the war. These camps were generally well run, following Geneva Convention guidelines closely. You'd live in wooden barracks, receive 3 meals a day, and have access to recreational activities. Many prisoners worked on farms or in factories, earning small wages. Some even attended educational programs or learned new trades. British prisoner of war camps were typically located in England, Scotland, or Canada. Conditions were usually decent, though food could be limited due to wartime rationing. British camps emphasized re-education programs, hoping to convince German prisoners to reject extremist ideologies. You might participate in discussion groups about democracy and human rights. Many prisoners appreciated these intellectual exchanges after years of military life. Liberation came with a price in French-controlled areas. Having suffered under German occupation, French treatment of prisoners could be harsh, especially in the immediate aftermath of liberation. Conditions improved over time, but initial months could be challenging. Perhaps the most feared fate was capture by Soviet forces. The Eastern Front had been particularly brutal, and Soviet treatment of German prisoners reflected this reality. Survival rates in Soviet camps were significantly lower than in Western Allied facilities. The contrast between these different experiences was stark and often determined by factors completely beyond a prisoner's control. Geographic location, timing of capture, and the military unit involved all played crucial roles. Western Allied camps generally maintained better records, allowed regular Red Cross inspections, and provided more consistent access to medical care. In contrast, the chaos of the Eastern Front and the massive numbers of prisoners taken there created logistical nightmares that affected basic survival. Many German families spent years not knowing which Allied power held their loved ones, making the uncertainty even more difficult to bear. Regardless of which power held you, daily life followed certain patterns. You'd wake before dawn to the sound of whistles or bells. Roll call happened twice daily, morning and evening, with prisoners lined up to be counted. Meals were simple but usually sufficient in Western camps. Breakfast might consist of ersatz coffee, bread, and sometimes porridge. Lunch and dinner typically included soup, bread, and occasionally meat or vegetables. Red Cross packages supplemented these rations when available. Work was a central part of prisoner life. The Geneva Convention allowed captors to require enlisted men to work, though officers were exempt. You might find yourself farming, building roads, working in factories, or maintaining the camp itself. Education and recreation helped pass the time. Many camps had libraries with books donated by the Red Cross or religious organizations. Prisoners organized language classes, taught each other skills, and formed sports teams. Some camps even had orchestras or theater groups. The social dynamics within camps created their own complex hierarchies and relationships. Military ranks often continued to matter, with former officers sometimes maintaining informal leadership roles among fellow prisoners. Friendships formed across regional and social boundaries that might never have been crossed in peacetime Germany. Some prisoners discovered talents they never knew they had, becoming teachers, artists, or craftsmen. Others struggled with depression and homesickness, finding it difficult to adapt to the loss of freedom and uncertainty about the future. The ability to maintain hope and find meaning in small daily routines often determined who thrived and who merely survived their captivity. As the war ended in May 1945, the process of repatriation began, but it wasn't immediate. Many German prisoners remained in captivity for months or even years after the war's end. The timeline for release depended on several factors: which country held you, your military rank, and whether you were suspected of war crimes. American and British forces began releasing prisoners relatively quickly, with most returning home by 1947. However, prisoners held by the Soviet Union faced a much longer wait. Some didn't return to Germany until the 1950s, and others never made it home at all. The journey back to Germany was often as challenging as captivity itself. You'd travel in overcrowded trains or trucks, with limited food and water. Many prisoners were shocked by what they found when they finally reached home: bombed cities, displaced families, and a country divided among the victorious powers. The logistics of moving millions of prisoners across war-torn Europe presented enormous challenges. Transportation systems had been devastated by bombing, and resources were scarce. Many former prisoners walked hundreds of miles to reach their home regions, carrying only small bundles of personal possessions. Border crossings could take days as Allied authorities processed the massive flow of returning soldiers and displaced persons. Some prisoners arrived home to discover their entire neighborhoods had been destroyed or that their families had fled west to escape advancing Soviet forces. The psychological preparation for these realities was impossible. No amount of mental preparation could ready these men for the extent of destruction they would witness. Returning home meant facing a new reality. Germany was in ruins, the economy was shattered, and society was rebuilding from the ground up. Many prisoners found their homes destroyed, their families scattered, and their old jobs gone. The psychological impact of captivity varied among individuals. Some prisoners had used their time constructively, learning new skills or languages that helped them adapt to post-war life. Others struggled with the trauma of combat, capture, and imprisonment. Many former prisoners rarely spoke about their experiences, viewing captivity as a shameful period best forgotten. It wasn't until decades later that historians began collecting these oral histories, recognizing their importance in understanding the complete story of World War II. The process of rebuilding personal identity proved as challenging as rebuilding the physical landscape. Many returning prisoners struggled with guilt, both for surviving when others didn't and for their role in the war itself. Some found strength in their prisoner of war experiences, having learned resilience and adaptability that served them well in post-war reconstruction. Others battled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, though such conditions were poorly understood at the time. Marriages and family relationships had to be rebuilt after years of separation, with children who barely remembered their fathers and spouses who had learned to live independently. The Germany they returned to was not just physically different, it was culturally and politically transformed, requiring these men to adapt once again to a completely new social order. The fate of German soldiers captured during World War II reminds us that even in wartime, humanity can prevail. While their experiences varied greatly, most survived their captivity and eventually returned home to rebuild their lives and their nation. These stories teach us about resilience, the importance of international law in protecting prisoners, and the complex human dimensions of global conflict. The men who surrendered on battlefields across Europe faced an uncertain future, but many found ways to maintain their dignity and hope even in the most challenging circumstances. Their experiences serve as a reminder that behind every uniform is a human being, someone with hopes, fears, and a family waiting for their return. Understanding these stories helps us better comprehend the true cost of war and the importance of working toward peaceful solutions to international conflicts. The next time you hear about prisoners of war, remember these German soldiers and the millions of others who found themselves caught between survival and surrender, between homeland and captivity, between war and the hope of peace. Perhaps most importantly, these stories demonstrate that even in humanity's darkest hours, the bonds of basic human decency often transcended national boundaries and political differences. Allied guards who shared their rations, prisoners who cared for the sick, and families who never gave up hope all contributed to the survival of millions. The legacy of these German prisoners of war is not just one of suffering endured, but of humanity preserved under the most trying circumstances. Their experiences remind us that while war brings out the worst in people, it can also reveal remarkable courage, compassion, and the unbreakable human spirit that refuses to surrender to despair.